Chapter 23. Halt, Will said thoughtfully as he walked away from the council with Halt and Erak. What did you mean when you said that about archers? Halt looked sideways at his apprentice and sighed. It could make a big difference to the outcome, he said. The Temujai are archers themselves, but they rarely have to face an enemy with any particular skill with the bow. Will nodded. The longbow was traditionally an Araluan weapon. Perhaps because of the island kingdom's isolation from the other countries on the eastern landmass, it had remained peculiar to Araluan. Other nationalities might use bows for hunting or even sport, but only in the armies of the Araluans would you find the mass groups of archers that could provide a devastating rain of arrows on an attacking force. They understand the value of the bow as a strategic weapon, he said, but they've never had to cope with facing it themselves. I got some inkling of that when Erak and I were running from them near the border. Once I'd put a few arrows close to them, they were decidedly reluctant to come dashing around any blind corners. The Jarl laughed quietly at the memory. That's true enough, he agreed. Once he had emptied a few saddles, they slowed down remarkably. You know, I've been thinking, said the boy, and hesitated. Holt grinned quietly to himself. Always a dangerous pastime, he said gently. But Will continued. Maybe we should try to put together a force of archers. Even 100 or so could make a difference, couldn't they? Holt shook his head. We haven't the time, Will, he replied. They'll be on us within 2 weeks. You can't train archers in that short a time. After all, the Skandians have no skill with the bow to begin with. You'd have to teach them the very basics. Knocking, drawing, releasing. That takes weeks, as you know. There are plenty of slaves here, Will persisted. Some of them would know the basics. Then all we'd have to do is control their range. Holt looked at his apprentice again. The boy was deadly serious, he could see. A small frown creased Will's forehead as he thought through the problem. And how would you do that? The ranger asked. The frown deepened for a few seconds as Will gathered his thoughts. It was something Evanlyn asked me that suggested it, she said. She was watching me shoot, and she was asking how I knew how much elevation to give a particular shot, and I told her it was just experience. Then I thought maybe I could show her, and I was thinking, if you created, say, 4 basic positions. He stopped walking and raised his left arm as if it were holding a bow, then moved it through 4 positions, beginning horizontally and ultimately raising it to a maximum 45-degree angle. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like that, he continued. You could drill a group of archers to assume those positions while someone else judged the range and told them which one to go to. They wouldn't need to be very good shots as long as the person controlling them could judge range, he finished. And deflection, Holt said thoughtfully. If you knew that at the second position your shafts would travel, say, 200 meters, you could time your release so that the approaching enemy would reach that spot just as the arrow storm did. Well, yes, Will admitted. I hadn't taken it that far. I was just thinking of setting the range and having everyone release at the same time. They needn't aim for individual targets. They could just fire away into the mass. You'd need to anticipate, Holt said. Yes, but essentially it would be the same as if I were firing 1 arrow myself. It's just that, as I released, I could call 100 others to do the same. Holt rubbed his beard. He glanced at the Skandian. What do you think, Erak? The Jarl merely shrugged his massive shoulders. I haven't understood a word you've been saying, he admitted cheerfully. Range, diffraction. Deflection, Will corrected him, and he shrugged. Whatever, it's all a puzzle to me. But if the boy thinks it might be possible, well, I'd tend to think he might be right. Will grinned at the big war leader. Erak liked to keep things simple. If he didn't understand a subject, he didn't waste energy wondering about it. I tend to think the same way, Halt said quietly, and Will looked at him in some surprise. He'd been waiting for his mentor to point out the fundamental flaw in his logic. Now he saw that Halt was considering his proposal seriously. Then he noticed the look of exasperation that grew on Halt's face as he found the flaw. "Bows," the ranger said, disappointment in his voice. "Where would we find 100 bows in time to let people train with them? There probably aren't 20 in all of Skandia." Will's heart sank as he heard the words. Of course. There was the problem. It took weeks to shape and craft a single longbow, trimming the bowstave just so, providing just the right amount of graduated flex along both arms. It was a craftsman's job, and there was no way they could have time to make the 100 bows they would need. Disconsolately, he kicked at a rock in his path, then wished he hadn't. He'd forgotten that he was wearing soft-toed boots. "I could let you have 100, Erak said, in the depressed silence that followed Halt's statement. Both the others turned to look at him. "Where would you find 100 longbows?" Halt asked him, after a long pause. Erak shrugged. "I captured a 2-masted cob off the Adeluan coast 3 seasons ago," he told them. He didn't have to explain that when a Skandian said season, he meant the raiding season. "She had a hold full of bows. I kept them in my storeroom until I could find a use for them. I was going to use them as fence palings," he continued, "but they seemed a little too flexible for the job." "Bows tend to be that way," Halt said slowly, and when Erak looked at him, uncomprehending, he added, "More flexible than fence palings. It's one of the qualities we look for in a bow." "Well, I suppose you'd know," Erak said casually. "Anyway, I've still got them. There must be thousands of arrow shafts as well. I thought they'd come in handy one day." Halt reached up and laid a hand on the massive shoulder. "And how right you were," he said. "Thank the gods for the Skandian habit of hoarding everything." "Well, of course we hoard," Erak explained. "We risk our lives to take the stuff in the first place. There's no sense in throwing it away. Anyway, do you want to see if you could use them?" "Lead on, Jarl Erak," Halt said, shaking his head in wonder and lifting an eyebrow at Will. Erak set out towards the large, barn-like storehouse by the docks, where he kept the bulk of his plunder. "Excellent," he said happily, rubbing his hands together. "If you decide to use them, I'll be able to charge Ragnak." "But this is war," Will protested. "Surely you can't charge Ragnak for doing something that will help defend Hallisholm." Erak turned his delighted smile on the young ranger. "To a Skandian, my boy, all war is business."